Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So we're just starting off with a question from M.A. Phillips, where they are asking if we could please confirm that the practical semester test 2, well, the second semester test, will be on the 29th of May. Mr. Labia, can you just check the emails that I sent out, I think 2 weeks ago or last week, where hopefully that was the last confirmed date. So while Mr. Labia is just checking that email, I will then continue with today's lecture, which is where Mr. Labia ended off last on Monday, and that was the final question for the Star Wars problem. So if you recall, we already answered, he answered question 7, which was to work out the index of the worst cantina for each planet. And so what we will now proceed with is the last question, which is the planet rating. And the difference in this particular question is that, unlike the previous examples that you have worked with, typically the question that precedes question 8 is a question that says, please define a subroutine or a function that will perform a certain calculation. So because we already asked that question in question 4, which is then used in question 5, we are unlikely going to ask you to do the same thing again in the same question paper. So you'll notice that question 8 doesn't actually have a preceding question. And so while some of you may want to still go ahead and write part of this code in a subroutine or a function of your choice, because now we're not saying you have to do it, but you are welcome to do it if you wish to, just to show off that you really have this modularity thing under control. However, my suggestion is please try to stick to the question here. So if we don't ask you to do additional extra stuff, try and keep it simple. Just answer it as is. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer this question as is, which is in a subroutine on its own. And I can see that Mr. Labia has confirmed that the last confirmed date for the semester test is Friday, the 29th of May, 2020. And it will take place during the practical time, as far as I understand. So your practical session 1 normally starts at 10 to 2. However, what we would like you all to do is to please be ready at least half an hour beforehand. You will access all your content, all your test stuff, the questions, etc. on Eve. We will I think, Mr. Labia, what we'll try and do is we will run a mock test. I think this is very important. We will run a mock test this Friday. Okay, we will set up a mock environment. We'll give you all the instructions, and maybe on tomorrow morning what we will do is we will set up the environment, show you exactly how you will go about to upload this test, your submissions and etc., where to find everything, and we will then have a trial run. So it's not an actual test, but we will ask you to try and test how you would upload your submission for the second semester test on Eve for the actual semester test. All right, so that will be this Friday, but I think tomorrow morning I will part of my lecture I will show you how to actually do this for test purposes instead. So on Friday, 29th of May, please make sure that even if you're in session 2 or session 3, it doesn't matter. Everyone will write the test at the same time. We will start at 2 o'clock, and you will have 3 hours to complete this test, after which you will then upload your submission on Eve. So we will show you, we'll give you a chance to test out how you will do this Friday, and maybe what we'll do is we will also keep a session open so that you can keep trying and testing until you get it right. Because remember, ladies and gentlemen, uploading your test correctly is going to be very important, because if you do not upload your test correctly, we will not be able to mark it. And we really want this to be, for most of you, the final time we have to assess you for Informatics 1A at least. All right, so having said that, let's continue with question 8 in our practical. And so I'm going to move this over here to the side, and now let's take a look at our actual code. So I have taken over from where Mr. Labia has done the calculate the worst cantina, and what I will now do is I will answer question 8, which is the last button, and that is to work out the planet ratings. Now with planet ratings, you may recall that the question actually says that you have to work out the question 8. Okay, let me just pause. Okay, ST Mashlangu is saying that they did question 8 and wrote it in a function, but VB gave you a warning by saying that the function rate does not return a value. Okay, so what I will do is I will answer this question as the question paper wants us to answer it, or is saying that this is the bare minimum in which you do it, and then I will do question 8 as a function like you have, and then we will see where you may have differed from me in that regard. All right, so let's proceed with this question 8. All right, so the idea is we need to calculate a rating for each and every single planet. So I know for a fact that that means I need at the very least a for loop to go through every single planet in my array. I will have a for P is equal to 1 to NP for each planet, and in each planet I must actually calculate the rating, and this rating is calculated by considering the size of the planet divided by the number of bad cantinas. Now if you think about it, size, this was a value that was input by the user, so the user input the size of the planet. However, the number of bad cantinas was something that was calculated in a previous question. So we've got two values there already, and we must simply divide it, because as you see in the question paper, it said size divide by bad cantinas, and if the value was less than 100, we get the rating A, and if it was 100 to 200, it was the value B, and if it's more than 200, it should be the value C. So going back down here, we will start with our select case. Now, you can use a select case, or you can, if you want to, write a bit more code and make sure you're doing everything step by step in case something goes wrong. This is another strategy you can go with. So the idea is not to try and write your code in the least amount of lines possible. I know that if you do it that way, you might come across as, yes, you know what you're doing, but when it comes to debugging, there may be more concerns because somewhere along the line the code has crashed. But because you've got such a long line of code, so if you write one single line of code which executes and performs a number of calculations, you may find that somewhere in that one single line of code something went wrong. So if we want to go very, very slowly, step by step, to make sure everything is correct so that you can also debug and make sure everything is correct, what you can do is you can declare a temporary variable. So I might call it temp, or maybe I will call it ratio, because it is effectively the ratio between size and bad cantinas. And you know that this value is a double because it is integer divided by another integer, and we will now say ratio is equal to planets P dot size divided by planets P dot bad cantinas. Okay, so what we've done here is we've merely declared a separate variable, and we're using it to store the ratio. So if we are working through our code and we notice that something is wrong with question 8, we can then step by step see what the calculations are doing. So if you have now declared a separate ratio, and on line 94 I actually work out what that ratio is, then before I actually subject it to the select case, I can then see, before I push it through to the select case, what is the value of ratio actually, to see, did I calculate this correctly? Okay, so this is just an example of how you could go about to test that your values are calculating correctly at each point. After that, we will now do the actual comparison. And remember, the question actually says a select case must be used. So that is a requirement. If you use an if statement, will your answer be correct? Well, if your if statement's code is actually correct, then yes, you will get some marks for your code, but you will get 0 for correctness because you did not follow the instruction that was applied. Okay, B. Masondo, you have a question. Please feel free to speak up and ask your question. Yes? Hello? Okay, B. Masondo seems to have disappeared. However, I've got another question in the chat window from KS Luchman. Random question, but where do we find yesterday's recorded video of Mr. Labia explaining function routines, etc.? Mr. Labia, I think you haven't downloaded and made it available yet. But if you, so the smaller size files are not available.
Yes, Prof.
Should be able to do is you should be able to see.
I don't know what it's only me.
Okay,
You
sorry,
keep
let me
on
just,
breaking.
okay, Venus, can you just wait? Okay, I would suggest that you go on, if you log in onto Blackboard and you click on the Blackboard Collaborate link, there is a menu on the top left corner. So if you look through the guide, you can see that they will show you where to download the original Blackboard videos. All right, anyway, yes, B. Masondo, where are you? Do you want to speak up and ask your question? B. Masondo, yes. Please ask your question. Okay, you're just making noise here. Unfortunately, we aren't hearing. Okay, yes, B. Masondo, please ask your question.
Yes, Prof.
Yes. Yes, you may proceed with your question. Yes, I can hear your question. I can hear you. Please ask your question. Yes, I can hear you. Please ask your question.
Prof.
Yes. Please ask your question.
Prof, I don't know whether it's my network. You keep on breaking.
Your what? B. Masondo, can you please just type your query? Please type your query in the chat window instead, because we can barely hear what you're saying. Rather type your query instead. Okay. All right. Let's proceed with the question that I've got here. So as you can see, the select case is the statement that, okay, B. Masondo, please just type your query in the chat window because we cannot hear what your question actually is. All right. So with my select case, let's continue. We now need to compare the ratio which we've just calculated on line 94. So I'm going to go select case ratio because this is the value I am comparing, and now I must proceed with the 3 different cases that are available. So case 1, and it is less than 100. So you can then say case is less than 100. Now I know there are a number of people who have asked, do you have to put the case is in there? And we find that you can actually just go case less than 100. However, I am old school and I normally type it with case is. So it's just the way the compiler worked at one point. So you would indicate the case is less than 100, and if that is the case, then you want to indicate that the rating is string. Okay, so how do we make it string? Well, we know that in your field, you do have, in your record structure planets, you do have a field called rating. So you can say rating is equal to A, all right? And that will handle the case when it is less than 100. Then you've got case 100 to 200, and in that case, you would say the planet's P dot rating is equal to B. And the last one, case, and now you go, case is greater than 200, because that is more than 200, and you say planet's P dot rating is equal to C. Once you have finished completing your select case, you will want to display the details on your UJ grid. And why do we display to the UJ grid? Because we are trying to display multiple values, because each planet, and you have more than one planet, they each need to have a rating of their own. So after my select case, still within my for next loop for each planet, I am going to display on line P in C plus, and now it's going to be 3 because it will be the third column after the last cantina, and then I will not use a C string because rating is already a string, and I will say planets P dot rating, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is how we would write the code for calculating and then displaying the rating for each planet. Now, going back to ST Mashlangu's question, which is they then did question 8, writing it in a function instead, and I'm very glad that you are, for practice purposes, doing so. My suggestion to you is to please, and not just to you, but to everyone that's in this class, this Google session right now, to please try and answer these kinds of questions where you answer it normally, but also try it as a function, but also try it alternatively using a subroutine instead, so that you're really practicing and trying all your options, because you don't know what my question will be. But if you practice all sorts of variations in these past papers, what will happen is you'll get the experience, and no matter what we throw at you, you know, the only thing that you're not prepared for when it comes to the 29th of May is you don't know what the story is, but you can handle anything that we throw at you. All right, so having said that, I will now go and write a function that will do the same thing. So the function, the purpose of the function, please remember, is that it does a certain task very well. So what is its task going to be? It is going to focus on taking a ratio, and it's going to say, let's look at this ratio. Do I give you an A, B, or C back in return? That is all what it should do. So what we can do here is we can say private function, and remember to use a verbal phrase, so maybe something along the lines of calculating. And in here, with your function, remember the function is going to return a string. So that's why I'm going to say private function calculating a string. And inside my parameters, I need to provide this function with the necessary values that it will use to return this calculation. So if we go back to our question 8, hopefully you've got that in front of you. You will remember that in order for it to work out whether it's A, B, or C, it needs 2 values. It needs a size and it needs a bad cantinas. So in my function here, I will do the same. I will go by val, right? And please note it's not by ref. And the reason why it's not by ref here is because, number 1, neither of the 2 values are actually arrays. And number 2, I do not intend to change the value of the size nor the number of bad cantinas. I'm only using those 2 values in order to work out whether it should be A, B, or C. So because I'm not changing either one, and these are neither arrays, it should be by val. So I am going to put in size there as integer, right, and by val, and then my second value is I'm going to call it BC to represent the number of bad cantinas, and in here I will now effectively do the same code as I have here. And so if I really wanted to be lazy, I could technically take all these lines of code here, Okay, or this. Please note, not the for loop, not the display, because this function is meant to calculate values. All right, and I will then take this code and put it in here, but not exactly. Okay, please note, not exactly. If you do that, if you just take this code and you say, I'm going to copy it, I'm going to paste it in here, and I'm going to say that is my function. Okay, first and foremost, obviously there's going to be a mistake because now they say, what is this P? All right, but beyond that, there's another reason why this is incorrect, and I will show you why now. So obviously, the ratio is now no longer planets P dot size, but rather it is the size variable that we have here and the BC variable here. So I am going to take this out instead, and I'm going to write it from scratch. Okay, so in the beginning, I'm going to try and duplicate this as much as possible. So I'm going to have a ratio variable, and I'm going to say ratio is equal to size divided by BC. So you can see that these two lines of code is exactly the same as these two lines of code at the moment. The next thing I have to do once I've worked out the ratio is I'm going to have a select case. And this select case is again going to compare ratio, but now the difference is this. Case is less than 100, so you can see exactly the same lines of code as here. So same, but this is not a coincidence. You shouldn't be, wow, why is it the same? It should be the same because I am writing a function that does exactly the same as this button here. The only difference is this function will be responsible for calculating one particular ratio and giving a rating at a time. So over here, once we've worked out that the case is indeed less than 100, the idea is not for you to copy this exact same code here and put it here. Okay, because remember, we don't know what planet's P.rating is. We don't know which planet we're looking at. This function is only focused on if you give me a size and if you give me a bad cantina value, I can give you ABC. Okay, I don't know for which planet it is. I don't care. You just give me the right size and you give me the right bad cantinas and I will give you a value in return. So what should happen here is either you go return A, or you could also go calc rating is equal to A. Now, I like to use return A for the reason that if I use return A, that will mean that once I find a match, I'm going to exit. I'm going to leave this function because there's no need to compare with the rest of the select case. Okay, and that's why I personally prefer the return instead of calc rating. But please remember that the select case technically works the same way. If it finds a match, it stops and it skips everything else afterwards. So the next thing here is case 100 to 200, and there you must return B. And then the last one is case is greater than 200, and you will see that it must now return C. Okay, so here you've got the return C, and I think this is where S2 Mashrangu is pointing out that they notice that there's a warning that says that the function rate does not return a value. Now, for me, I get a different error message. Mine says function calc rating does not return a value on all code paths. Now, this likely means that why your warning says function rate is because you named your function rate, whereas I'm calling my function calc rating. But this, ladies and gentlemen, is perfectly normal. Please don't panic if you see a squiggly green line in your functions, because what this merely means is this. It's saying that you have given me a task. You've given to me two values, and in return, I must take these two values and I must return either A, B, or C. But my concern, Visual Studio is saying that Visual Studio is a bit concerned that there is a possibility that this function will not return either A, B, or C in some situation. All right? And this is not really going to happen because if you think about it, can you all see that this will return either A, B, or C for something. Can you see that? Because regardless of what value you have, it will either be A, B, or C. It's not like it's saying that the case is 0 to 100, because if it was 0 to 100, then there's a possibility that if I get a value, a ratio of -6, it's not going to be A, it's not going to be B, and it's certainly not going to be C either. So in that situation, what this green squiggly line is that it's Visual Studio being concerned and giving you a warning. Now, squiggly green lines, as you see here, the one I've highlighted there, these are not a train smash. And in Visual Basic, especially in Informatics 1A and in 1B, if you have a squiggly green line and you see that, hey, you know what? You have written the code fully. You've considered all the conditions, and it still gives you a squiggly green line, it is actually okay. Don't worry, don't panic. This is not a problem. The problems that you have to look out for is when it's a squiggly red line. Because if it's a squiggly red line, it means that Visual Studio will not compile. So, for example, if I go select you, you see there now there's squiggly red lines. And if there's a squiggly red line and when I try to press start, I'm going to get this error message that says, no, there's bold errors, you will not be allowed to continue. So this is what you need to watch out for, because this means that your program doesn't compile, therefore you cannot even run it to get it to work. So please note that squiggly red lines are a no, but squiggly green lines, which are just warnings, they are okay. And in fact, those of you who do Computer Science 1A, you probably have come across many lines of warnings in your code. And so please note, warnings are okay. Maybe for new programmers, you get a little anxious because you see warnings. Warnings are not necessarily a bad thing. It is just Visual Studio being overly cautious if they're saying, hey, you know what, are you sure? Because we are concerned here that this code might somehow not return something. So in between, there's this question, how do we put UJ grid debug stage off? Mr. Lebier showed you how to do that in yesterday's tutorial, so please just go through that. And I think in previous lectures as well we've mentioned that. Then AL Ndove has G, I don't know what the G means. Then MHC Gwala said, will we lose marks for submitting a program with warnings? No, you will not lose. Well, okay, this is a very the most immediate answer I will give is no, you won't. However, it depends on what kind of warning it is. My feel is if it is a warning in this particular situation, you will not lose the marks. And the reason for that is because you are complying with exactly what we ask you to do. And the error is really just a warning that says, we are concerned that your function is not returning. And it says here, this particular warning there, doesn't return a value on all code paths. If this is the case, you please don't try to fix it. Submit it as is. You would definitely not lose the marks for this kind of warning. All right. However, for those of you who are very anxious and saying, well, I really don't want to have that error in my code, is there something I can do about it? You can technically do this, all right? I'm not in favor of this, please note, but you can technically define calc rating. Okay, let's do that here. Let's put that at the top. Okay, so what has happened here now is you have, in a way, set calc rating to a value. In my case, I've set calc rating to an empty string, but we know that calc rating will never ever return an empty string because it will be catered either by A, B, or C, because this handles or possibilities. Okay, and then Emma Arzaga has a question because you raised your hand, so please ask your question.
Ma'am, it doesn't really relate to the calculating function, but I would like to ask, adding on to what one of the students just asked, with the debug state of the UJ grid, is that what causes your program to not want to resize the grid, even
No,
though code is proper?
no, no. Where the debug state is merely a status on your UJ grid that is used to either be more informative or less informative with the errors. So when your debug state, by default, your debug state is on, and you will notice that if you make errors with your code, what will happen is you will get a message box pop up to tell you exactly what you did wrong. So you might find that it will say, hey, you know what? You tried to go and refer to row 6, but you only have 4 rows. That will be the kind of error message that the debug state provides, but it will not interfere with how you resize the grid or so on. Okay.
Okay, 'cause I was asking pertaining to a problem that I had as to it not wanting to resize, and then it says that so basically it resizes before placing your text inside your grid, and then it does not resize as soon as you try to place the text. As it says, there are only you do not have more than one row or something of that sort with the columns as well. And then it just
Well,
places it in row 0, column 0.
well, you won't be able to proceed with it if the error message is telling you that you cannot do what you just did. So you attempted to resize the grid or certain column or so on, and it says you cannot do it. It's not stopping you from doing something. It's telling you you cannot. It's that debug state doesn't stop you from doing something. It just tells you that the grid itself will stop you from doing something. So if you have 3 text boxes on your form, and now you want to magically talk about a 4th text box that doesn't exist, of course the code is not going to let you do something. The debug state is merely there to help you, to explain to you that, listen, the UJ grid would not have allowed you to proceed with this anyway. We're just telling you why it won't let you. Okay.
Oh, all right. Thank you.
Okay. And then the next question is T. Kartler says, can I ask a question of interest? Since most of the programming languages are in English, example having special keywords like public, private, while, function, are all the programmers forced to know English to be able to code? Not necessarily. Please note that when you are working with private, function, etc., these are, yes, certain commands in English, but everything else is actually, you can type it in your own language if you really wanted to. So your variable names, etc., those you can use in your own language. You know, although one thing is, in the years I've seen, as long as the keywords that you use, so option, public, you know, when you want to declare something for, cin, these are all things that must be in English because they are named that way. But if you were to write your own code in some other language, you are welcome to type it out. The only thing I can't imagine it happening is, you know, if you're Korean or Chinese or Japanese, you know, those funny characters there. I think I would struggle to type out the variable names in here, but I've never really seen that. But one thing I have noticed in when I started off as an assistant is I noticed the following. So it was an Afrikaans student who was sitting there, and in, you know, after declaring so and so, like for example, they declared their variables, what they tried to do is they said for p is equal to n dot np. Now, obviously, you can see that in my example, maybe open the p. Okay, you can see that this is absolutely disastrous because VB doesn't know what you're talking about. This might be the Afrikaans version of the for loop, because look, there's for in Afrikaans, all right? There's the two, but hey, you know, VB goes, what are you going on about? But you know, nothing stops you from using your own, you know, like these prompts here. You can type it in whatever language you want. The variable names, when you declare your structures, you can declare it in the programming, in the natural language that you want. All right. Although I am going to ask you, please, to rather write your variables in code in English for this module, because my assistants probably will not know what you are talking about if you write it in some other program, in some other language when you name your variables. Remember, the idea is you need to name your variables in such a way that when we mark it, we know what you are asking about. All right. So in a way, yes, you have to still type in English, but basically the keywords that the commands that the programming languages need to know, you must type it in that way. All right, so having said that, I have now, just to quickly do a recap, shown you how you can get rid of the warning. Okay, you can get rid of the warning by setting it to an empty string before you use it, because now we know that even if we don't magically get an A, B, or C, we know that at the very least it's still going to return an empty string, and that makes Visual Studio a lot more comfortable with your function. I know it's strange, but you know, Visual Studio is very worried sometimes, and so if you want to make them feel less worried, you know, your assistants are not going to be worried about it, Visual Studio does, okay? Then please feel free to do this. Otherwise, this is absolutely not necessary. That warning is absolutely fine. Now, having said that, because this is in place, you cannot now duplicate this code in here and then tell me that, hey, you know what? You wrote this function, and you wrote this code, so give me all the marks. All right. So if you are going to ask us, if you are asked to write a function, so let's think question 8 was, you must answer this, but do this writing a function. So you wrote the function here, and then you wrote this, and then you say, well, I wrote a function, and I've got my code here, and it gives me the correct result, so can I have 100%? And if you write 100, you're not going to get 100% for this particular question, because we're gonna then complain and say, well, you know what the problem is? You are asked to write this code in a function, but then you did write it in a function, but then you went and wrote the code again here. So in other words, did you use the function at all in your code? No, you didn't, and so you will lose your marks. So how do you rewrite this code in such a way that you do use the function? Well, you would take out, I think maybe I mustn't, I'm going to comment it out because this is actually correct. And instead of using the same code as we have here, which you can see has been presented, I'm going to call the function instead. And in order for me to call the function, I will do the following. I will say planets p.rating is equal to calc rating, because remember, you are asking the function to give you the answer of the rating and store it in this particular field. And now for this calc function, I need to pass it the two values it needs, and those two values are planets p dot size, because that's the first value that needs to be given, and then planets p dot bad containers. Right, so having done that, you're basically calling the function. So you can see that all this code needs to go away if you have this function instead. All right, now I'm going to just go back to the comments here, and RJ Zita says, but in my opinion, using our languages when programming doesn't seem to be a good practice. Yes, I agree with you. Right now, it's not a great idea, because remember, you're trying to ensure that your program is as accessible to others as possible. Accessible right now means your assistant needs to be able to mark your code. And I don't know, maybe Mr. Labia, would you like to put in your 2 cents. How would you feel if someone wrote a VB program using variables and prompts, all the descriptions and etc. So your button is in your home language? How would you feel about marking the code? Mr. Libya? Okay, I don't know. Yeah.
I'm part of the question.
Sorry, Mr. Libya. So the question is, how would you feel if we took this entire code, this entire program, and so the instructions here, or the buttons here, that's still fine, but the code behind the scenes. So instead of having planets.name, we are going to use all the variable names in using your home language to name the variables instead. How would you feel about marking that?
It would depend. It's one of those things where if it's a language that I understand, it's going to be something that would be pleasurable to mark. But if it's a language I don't know completely, it's going to be something I would not want to mark, and therefore the person might lose marks. So I would say, in the grand scheme of things, looking at the majority of the diversity of the markers that we have, it wouldn't be a good idea to write it out in any language other than English, because you don't know if the person is going to be reading it understands that language or not.
Okay, all right. So yes, RJ Zita, in your opinion, you're right. It doesn't seem to be good it's not such a good practice. But if you were, for example, in France, where basically everybody speaks French, you will see that when they write their code, they might use variable names in French and everything, and their comments might all be in French. But at the end of the day, the idea is you should still be able to read that code and get a sense more or less of what it is doing. But because maybe you don't speak French, you come across a variable name and you're like, oh, what does that variable mean? What is it supposed to do? And it does take a bit of time to try and follow the process to figure out, oh, that variable is used to store this value over this value, but I don't actually know what those values are. Right, then B. Masondo, you've now typed out this code, and now you go, is there any problem if I have done that above? I would say, let's see, I don't see why you would have a problem, but as I've mentioned earlier, the idea is the reason why I have declared lines 94 and 95 earlier in the session. I explained that if we do this, this makes it easier for us to debug our program if we find that something is going wrong in question 8 and we cannot figure out why. Then rather than what you've done there, where you just say select case and instead of ratio, you actually replace that ratio with that there, right there in here instead. The problem is that line of code, there's at least 2 calculations happening at the same time, because you are dividing to get the ratio, and once you've got the ratio, you're not even storing it anywhere, so you don't know what the value is, but they've worked it out somehow, and you're immediately comparing it. So what I have done is I've merely done it step by step in a more slow manner, so there's more lines of code as a result, but when I have to debug my code, this will make it easier for me. But that's just a personal preference. There's no reason why you cannot do what you have done. All right. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is basically this part of the question. I've shown you now how to do it as a function, how to do it without a function. So these lines of codes are without a function, but you leave this out, then you have to take this out. But if you do it as a function, then you write this code, and you need to make sure that you call the function inside your for loop. Please note that in this question, to calculate the rating, and this is something that you need to make sure you understand very carefully, and that is this rating calculates the rating for one planet at a time. Okay, we're not asking this function to calculate X planets all in one go, only one planet at a time, and that is why you'll notice that there is 0 for loops in here, because the for loop happens in the button itself. For every single planet, please call this function, because it will work out the rating for the current planet I am on. Now, there's only 1 minute remaining here, but my suggestion to you all is that if you want to do well and practice as much as possible, please try and write a subroutine version of this code so that you can modify this particular line and it actually works out the subroutine instead. All right, because it is slightly different. Okay, and that is it for today. But ladies and gentlemen, tomorrow during our lecture, what will happen is we will set up everything and show you how to upload your practical semester test submission onto Eve. And then this Friday, we will have a mock session where you can upload a test. That is all for today. Starting tomorrow after this, we are going to look at practical. We're going to look at the past paper. Specifically, we are going to look at paper B of the second semester test from last year. So if you want to start working on this already, please do so, and we will go through it tomorrow. Right, then the next question is, when is last week's touch going to be uploaded? You mean the video, I assume? Well, Mr. Libya, Mr. Libya handled all the tutorials last week, so we will go and we will make a smaller size of it. But in the meantime, if you want to download it, it is actually available on the Blackboard Collaborate menu itself. So if you want to get the original videos, they are on Blackboard Collaborate. All right. Okay. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, Y Valentincini is asking, will our attendance to these online classes affect having to write the exam? No. What will affect you having to write the exam? Well, that's a bit of a weird question. So I would suggest that you don't have to attend these particular lectures, but I would suggest that you at least download the recordings if you're not able to attend the full session, so that you can watch the videos and learn from it. And if you have any queries, please ask us those questions on the Discord channel. But in order for you to be able to write the exam, of course, you need to know what's going on. So I suggest please work through it. Then Bima Sondo is asking, is there any Prac 10 this Friday? Ideally, we should have a practical this Friday. However, my understanding is that computer science is next week. So yes, we will have a practical that you can upload for next week, and that will prepare you better for the, well, look, the more practicals we give you, the better it is, honestly. So yes, we will have a practical 10. It will be a past paper as well. Please try and do as many of these things as possible. All right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That is it for today. I will see you tomorrow morning when we go through the test as well as paper B of the second semester test. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.